is there a reason that something like Valentine
on open it's possible. Yeah. Open does have odd restrictions. Do you want another physical plug?
No. Well, I can't find the USB to Ethernet.
Do you need a USB-C or standard USB?
USB to Ethernet, that would be. I can't find the plug that I normally use. So.
I do have one.
If you do, that would be nice.
Peter?
Yes.
How do I turn this on?
It's on.
It's on. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Graduate School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. We are very delighted to host you here for the next few days and discuss what we feel are some really important things for our profession and for our country. I'd like to thank you for coming literally from sea to shining sea. We've got representatives from across the country. And I would really like to thank the National Science Foundation for their support, for paying for everyone's travel, and for making this workshop possible. We've got a good mix of folks, about half scientists and half informal science education professionals. So it should be the food for some fruitful conversations. And everyone has the agenda and whatnot, and we'll go follow that as closely as possible. So I don't want to go over specifics about the agenda. Our goal over the next few days is to come up with some creative ideas. Stephanie was across from me at dinner last night, and she used that word several times, creative. And I thought about it a lot this morning as I was getting ready. The things that we've been doing to educate people about the poles and what's happening to our planet, we've been doing similar things for many years. IPY initiatives really gave education about the poles a boost a dozen or so years ago. But you'll see from the results of our baseline study that people still don't really know much about the Arctic, and that's what we're going to focus on, the Northern Pole. And they don't really care a whole lot. So we have to have some creative thinking about how to change this. How, if we keep doing the same things we've been doing, we're not really going to continue to make a dent. So keep those creative thoughts going over the next few days. And we'd like to end this workshop having some concrete ideas for collaborative activities and so forth that we could do following this workshop. I want to speak a little bit about the process that we will use for the breakout sessions, because as with almost every meeting, the most fruitful parts of the meeting are when you all get to speak with each other, not just listen to us up here, where we've got 4 groups, so each group is between 10 and 12 people, and everyone will be mixed up throughout the next few days, so that hopefully you'll get to be in breakout groups with different people in different rooms. We have assigned you to 2 breakout groups, and the letters are on the back of your name tags. We'll explain what that means later, but you'll have an opportunity to meet and talk with different folks. Also, we've got 4 breakout rooms, which we will tell you where they are when the time comes. And we'd like to volunteer from each group, from each breakout group, somebody, when you get together, decide who will help to move the conversation along, be that point person, and then we'll also ask kindly for a note keeper. And then when we come back to report out from the breakout groups, we'd like a PowerPoint slide for each group. So again, we'll go over that when the time comes, but I just wanted to kind of lay that out. In terms of some logistics, the restrooms are all located right there, so if you exit on this side of the room and go directly across, there's the male and female restroom. We have a water dispenser right across from where you pick picked up your badge and your water bottle. And I also wanted to mention this art exhibit that's in our visitor center here. It's just been installed this week. Friday evening there'll be a private art show, and then Saturday an art show open to the public. The artist is Lori Jeremiah. She's an award-winning artist, and there's some beautiful watercolors out there, so I encourage you to take some time to look at those. And if you're hankering to get outside on this beautiful Rhode Island beach day, directly through the art exhibit, there's a set of double doors that are open. If you go straight ahead, there's doors out to the terrace, and you'll have a beautiful view of Narragansett Bay, which is where we're located. Any questions about logistics or process before we begin our program? Okay, great. So we're just going to jump right in, and we'll have our first speaker this morning. We're very lucky to have Valentine Kass. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you, Andrea. There's two things I haven't done. We didn't introduce ourselves. I'm jumping ahead. And also, I wanted to introduce the team. So thank you. Andrea keeps me on task. I'd like to introduce the team that's been working to plan this meeting. Andrea Gingras, who's sitting down here in the front. Most of you have met her this morning. And Lisa Hotali, who's right there. I think you met her. And then Peter Tuttendum, who's up in the back. Peter, in addition to helping us plan the workshop, is live streaming the plenaries and breakouts this morning on YouTube. So we're hoping more people can tune into us virtually. And then we're going to do our introduction. So what I'd like everybody to do, we'll just zigzag across the rows and just say your name. Stand up when it's your turn and just say your name and the institution that you're representing this week. So Stephanie, we'll start with you.
Stephanie Sherman, now at Arizona State University.
Mary Miller at the Exploratorium.
Linda Fernandez, Virginia Commonwealth University.
Max Berkelhammer, University of Illinois, Chicago.
Valentine Kass, the National Science Foundation.
Anna Gold from CO Boulder.
I'm Catherine Meyer from Prospect Data Center. Caitlin Mattis with the University of Colorado and the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium.
Mark Eater from Lamont Reinhardt Observatory. Elaine Sparrow from the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
I'm Vanessa Bosky from Villanova University.
Amy Laura Lovecraft, also from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I'm a Pisces. See, we're all at that water. Water's fun.
Well, that's great. So
Sorry.
I'm Jennifer Francis. I've been at Rutgers University for the past 24 years, but starting next week I'll be at the Woods Hole Research Center.
Susan Heilman from the Museum of Science in Boston.
I'm Patrick McShay from Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh.
Nicole Mazzardi from University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Karen Romano Young from Chronicle Plus, and those are my comics outside.
Jason Ray, Center of Science and Industry in Columbus, Ohio.
I'm Katie Propp, also from the Science and Industry Museum of Columbus.
Elliot Smith from The Ohio State University.
I'm Lisa Bush from the Sitka Sound Science Center.
I'm Luis Pomares, and I'm a new student here at Crystal.
Carlisa Paul from the Pacific Science Center.
Jason Servanak, The Ohio State University.
Janice McDonald from Rutgers University.
Tom Leijman from Virginia Institute of Clean Science.
Oscar Kowalski from Scripps.
Jamie Bell from Kass, Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education.
From Detroit, Snagger, from Brown.
Janet Warburton from the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States.
Judy Fonstock from the same place.
Lindsay Bartholomew from the Museum of Science in Boston.
Lauren Frisch from the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Holly Moore, the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography, Inner Space Center, if I want to have as many acronyms in my name as possible.
Good morning. Hi up there. Rachel Valletta, the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia, PA, also a Pisces.
And I'm Chris Knowlton,
from the University of Rhode Island, Graduate School of Oceanography, Inner Space Center.
Hi there. I'm Tina Bishop from the College of Exploration, and we're in Virginia.
And I'm Peter Tuddenham, thank you.
Great. Well, I think you'll all agree we've got a wonderful diversity of institutions represented. And again, thank you all for coming. And I realize I never introduced myself. I'm so anxious to get to the program. My name is Gail Scowcroft, and I'm the Associate Director of the Inner Space Center here. I'm also the Executive Director of something called the Consortium for Ocean Science Exploration and Engagement, otherwise known as COSE. And I want to speak about oceans and climate and polar stuff. I'm happy to speak about all those kinds of things. So we'll start our program now. And our first speaker is Valentine Kass from the National Science Foundation. And Valentine is going to set the stage for us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I expected a much more informal situation here, and I haven't prepared any formal remarks. But first, I do want to thank Gail and her team for organizing this workshop. I think it's really important, and it's really exciting to see all the different people from different institutions here together. So I should just say a little bit more about myself so you know who I am. Some of you I've known for going back to the IPY days, but many of you I'm meeting for the first time, and I welcome. I got to talk with some of you last night at dinner. For those of you I haven't met, I look forward to meeting you over the next couple of days. I've been a program director at the NSF since 2001. I was hired to work in the Informal Science Education Program, ISE, which now has the fancier title, Advancing Informal STEM Learning, ASL. You know, everything in government has to have an acronym. But none of us have an acronym as good as this workshop. I love the idea of ARISE. Anyway, my focus has always been on the educational media portion of the ISE portfolio, mainly television, film, multimedia. In the early days, I also did the radio sections, but of course sprinkled with a lot of other projects. When IPY came around, NSF was the lead federal agency for IPY, and there was a working group formed. They wanted someone from the education directorate to work with the science directorates, and I was probably the only program officer who had ever been to Antarctica, so I was asked to be the co-lead, which was a great honor, and I loved all of that work. I'm very proud of what we accomplished. And since then, I've worked a lot with the Office of Polar Programs. In the last 3 years, I was asked to be the liaison from education to the polar programs, and actually assigned half-time to the polar program. And I manage the Antarctic Artists and Writers program, and we have a recipient here. Great to meet you. But more and more, I also am focused on the Arctic. As most of you here probably know, 2 years ago, NSF developed 10 big ideas, around scientific questions and concerns that also had a major impact on society at large. And one of those 10 ideas, big ideas for priority research, was navigating the new Arctic, which we call the NNA.
I'm sorry, can we get the microphone turned up a little? I'm having a little hard time.
If you just stand up
Your
and
podium microphone, the microphone you're using is for the live streams, so it's not going to project. So if you, so that one is probably better. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I was trying to avoid the podium. So navigating the new Arctic is one of the major 10 priorities for ideas are meant to given the challenges and complex changes that are happening in the Arctic, require obviously lots of different scientific expertise to understand those changes, develop models for how that's going to impact not only the Arctic but the rest of the environment below the Arctic Circle. But another major component of the big ideas is to have an educational component. So that this is why this group here is so essential. One of the things that I wanted to do is ask the scientists in the room to again, I know you've all quickly introduced yourself, but to raise your hands so the informal science education people can know who the scientists are. And take a look at each other. One question I have for the scientists is how many of you are meeting other scientists here for the first time? Quite a few. That's fantastic. I think scientists tend to be in their silos, and of course more and more. I didn't know in terms of the Arctic, there's so much interdisciplinary work that's going on that how much you all will know each other. But I think it's terrific that the scientists here will also be meeting other scientists and making that network even bigger. And in terms of the informal science education people, I know from the roster that most of you are from museums. So the museum people, can you raise your hand? So the scientists can know who are the museum folks. And then there are a few people from the informal science education field that are not museum folk. Can you raise your hands? There are a few of you. So I know a couple of you. I don't know what that you do. I very much want to figure out who you are and what you do. One of them I know is an artist who was part of the Antarctic Artists and Writers Program. One of them I know is Gail, who is the director of the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education. And if you are not familiar with Kass, K-A-I-S-C-A-I-S-E, and their website is informalscience.org. That has a lot of resources for both scientists and informal science education folks. So why is ISE important? What distinguishes informal science education? I mean, obviously not to disparage formal education, pre-K to 12, college, graduate school is all very important. All of us in this room would be here if we hadn't had a lot of formal education. But if you think about it, assuming that we don't die young, most of our life is spent outside of school. And most people understand, to the extent that they understand science, it's through informal science education type of experiences, which can range from television, film, it can be museum exhibits, botanic gardens, visiting zoos. It can be involved in citizen science projects. More and more, of course, is web-based. There's no limit to what it can be, as long as it's sort of outside of the formal education arena. But of course, those lines are blurring more and more as well. And I think that's a positive thing. But what distinguishes informal science education from formal? I think the main difference, the starting point difference, is that informal science education projects are the best ones anyway. Really start with identifying the audience. Who is your audience? What do they know? What are they interested in? What motivates them? What are they curious about? And which is completely different with how formal education begins. Formal education begins with a curriculum, a biology 101, and you have this text, biology 101, and you have this group of people that you want them to learn biology 101. regardless of who they are or what they bring to the classroom. And I think the wonderful, exciting part of informal education is that it just changes that model completely. But it's a challenge to understand your audience, and but that is the challenge. So a good ISE project understands their audience and then understands what the goals are. Gail asked me to talk about, well, how do we know success? What is the measure of success? Well, that's a really difficult question because the projects are so diverse, and every project has different goals. And I think it's really important to start out with one, understanding your audience, and one, understanding what the goals of your project are. And then working with the evaluator and researchers to figure out how you could measure that success. And success can also be failure, actually, to be honest. Sometimes we learn more from failure than we do from success. All ISE funded projects must put their summative evaluations post them on the informalscience.org website. So I commend you to that website to take a look at the range of projects and what has been learned. The other thing that we insist upon with good projects is that they build on past projects. They are not just reaching their audience, but somehow building the field, pushing the field in its boundaries in creative different ways. We don't have a set understanding of what that is that we take from PIs, the proposals that come to us, and we try to identify what are the cutting edge, what's going to not only be successful in terms of the target audience, but what is also going to help build knowledge of the field in terms of what works and what doesn't work. I would stop there and just see if there are questions, comments.
Hi, I'm Lisa Bush from the Kass Science Center, and my question is, from your perspective, the National Science Foundation, what gaps in AISL for the Arctic are you seeing that necessitated this workshop?
Well, I think just to expand the amount of educational materials about the Arctic, I think Gail's going to talk about some of her research, which shows that the majority of people still don't either know about the Arctic or what's happening in the Arctic or care about what's happening in the Arctic. And so I think of informal science education, I think of our culture, I don't watch it goes. And I think that, our culture is made out of patches of different colors and different shapes, and they're all sort of stitched together. And so I think of informal science education as trying to expand those patches, the colorfulness of those patches, the size of those patches, the number of those patches, so that STEM is part of more embedded in our culture. And I think clearly, given that the Arctic is so important and one of the priority goals, that bringing together scientists and informal science education people is essential, because scientists alone don't have the time or the resources or the expertise to do major outreach to the public. But when scientists and ISE institutions partner, then broader impacts can be accomplished. So that's what we hope that this will be just one of those impetus to bring together new partnerships that will come up with creative ideas to find new ways to bring the public into the process of science that's going on you think about sort of the crossover? So for instance, data and the Arctic, because most people never get to the Arctic, data is how we often understand what's happening there. So when we're thinking about these sort of big themes and as we kind of go through this workshop, are there ideas that happen between those?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there is a, I think you know this, it's your colleague letter that encourages proposals to both basal and undergraduate and DRK-12 to bring polar data to the public and find ways to do that. So yes, absolutely. Big ideas are not meant to be siloed. I mean, there's a lot of genetic work that's being done in the Arctic too, which crosses over with genomics and so forth. So yes, to the extent that you can think of ways to build those bridges, that would be fantastic. Yeah, good. Well, anyway, I look forward to talking more with you, and I expect a lot of good things to come out of this meeting. Thank you, Valentine.
One of the things that struck me as Valentine was speaking, it's not a direct correlation, but it was a thought that got sparked, so I'm going to share it, is that the public doesn't, I don't think, really understand that scientists are adventurers, and I think Arctic scientists are true adventurers. And I'm going to talk to you now about one of our projects and the results from a national baseline study and a study of a small pod of undergraduates that really exemplify just how adventurous it can be. So this work was done as part of the Northwest Passage Project. The Northwest Passage Project is funded by the National Science Foundation and with additional support from the Heising-Simons Foundation. And the idea is to have a full-scale research project led by a team of scientists and also that will also engage at sea 22 undergraduate and graduate students. And the original plan was to also engage some high school students, which I'll talk about in a second. But the idea is that we're going to collect a lot of data in this area that's not well studied and not well understood, and yet it is a critical choke point for circulation between the Arctic and the Antarctic and what happens with the meltwater flowing through. So the goals of this project, there's several goals, but I've just pulled out 3 that are germane to us here today. The main goal overall is to increase public awareness and understanding of the changing Arctic and also the research that is being conducted in this very important area of Earth. We also want to extend the capacity of informal science education institutions to connect with Arctic scientists, hence the direct correlation to this workshop here this week. And also to help the ISE field have a better understanding of the process, the learning process, when the public is engaged in real time with scientists, whether those scientists are in the room with them or the scientists are virtual from sea. So in order to achieve these goals, there are several things that we are doing. As I mentioned, there's a research expedition into the Northwest Passage. That expedition was originally supposed to take place in summer of 2016. Here's where the adventure story starts. And we were going to take 36 students, which included some high school students, and the ship that we contracted pulled out 6 weeks before the expedition, not leaving us enough time to find another ship. ship was going to take us in summer of 2007, this summer, I'm sorry, 2018, and the first expedition was 2017, not 16, sorry. Anyway, the Edmondson was going to take us this summer. We found out in March that the Edmondson blew one of its 5 engines, and the Canadian Coast Guard was not going to allow it to be up in the passage in August without all engines. And so the ship had to be brought back to Quebec to have its engines repaired. So we lost that ship. And then we scrambled in March, and we were very fortunate to find another ship to take us this past summer, and that is the Academic Yafi, owned by the Russian Science Federation. That's the wrong name, but it's owned by the Russians, and being operated by a Canadian company, One Ocean Expeditions, and then chartered by us, a U.S. institution. And so we went full steam ahead. We had our great group of participants and scientists. Everyone flew up to Canada to get ready to fly into the Northwest Passage, where they would board the ship in Resolute. As things happen in the world, there were lots of ice flows in Lancaster Sound, and they had literally clogged the port of Resolute. And so at the 11th hour, the night before the plane was going to take off from Edmonton to Resolute, they had to change the route of the plane, the charter aircraft, to a tiny little village, Cougaroo, village of 800 people, where the planes would land on a sandy airstrip, and everyone was then put in Zodiacs to board the vessel. And that all happened without a hitch, and there's a few of you in the room that were there. Holly was there, Max, Don Glide were there on the ship. Everything was good to go. The ship was out about 16, 17 hours, and it went aground on an uncharted geologic feature. So our team of Arctic adventurers were stopped dead in their tracks by an uncharted feature. And you know, that's what happens in this world. And people have said to me, oh boy, how do these things happen? This never happens. I said, oh no, au contraire. Right? When the Polynesians were trying to discover New Zealand, how many watercraft did they get in the water before they were successful? How many ships did the Irish put in the North Atlantic when they were trying to find North America? And then how many ships did the Spanish put in the water before they were trying to find North America? So we have exploration in our blood, and this is the excitement that I'm hoping we as a community can deliver to our audience, various audiences. The Arctic is a place ripe for exploration, as exemplified by what happened to us this summer. Our folks, by the way, were all rescued. Everybody's home safely, and we're hoping that we will continue with our expedition next summer, so stay tuned for that. So anyway, that little story leads me back to this. So when we do get to see, we'll be doing live broadcasts from the Inner Space Center. You're going to get a tour of that facility. I believe it's today. The Inner Space Center is a national facility. It does for ocean science what Kennedy Space Center does for space science. We are a hub for ocean science exploration and research, and we have a mission control facility. And how many of you have heard of the Inner Space Center before? Please raise your hands. Okay, about a third of you. How many of you have heard of NASA's Kennedy Space Center? Raise your hands. I press my point. Yeah, we don't have a lot of interest as humans in supporting what we don't see. And I think that space is something we can see the stars, we can see the planets. We don't get to see the Arctic, we don't get to see what's under the ocean. And so part of our job is to generate interest for those kinds of things. We also will have a full film crew on the ship. David Clark and his colleagues will be producing a 2-hour documentary of this expedition. We'll post daily highlights on our videos. We're conducting webinar series and so forth. And just for the scientists and the education folks in the room, I just wanted to share with you the main research themes that we'll be looking at. So, as I mentioned, this area is really an important area for understanding the circulation of water between the Arctic and the North Atlantic. It's very important for considerations of climate change. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but you can go on the project website and learn a little more. Also, there'll be scientists that specialize in microscopic communities and looking at what's happening due to the changing ice, the increase in meltwater, and so forth. And then, importantly, greenhouse gas fluxes, what's happening with greenhouse gases in the Northwest Passage between the atmosphere and the ocean, and in the marine water itself, and also in general distributions of marine life. So now I'm going to talk to you about this baseline study. And this was not conducted by me, so I cannot claim to have done the research, and therefore that disclaimer means I may not be able to answer all of your questions if you have them. It was conducted by People, Places, and Design Research. They've got a very long and illustrious career of doing this kind of work. So they created a survey that was sent out to the 4 U.S. regions, the Southeast, Northeast, middle of the country, and the West. And they ended up with about 720 surveys out of the 920 completed that they felt were valid. And so the results I'm going to share with you come from that sample. And here's a little bit of info on that sample. It was almost 50-50 men and women. Pretty well distributed across folks born from 1955 through 1998, with a few of us baby boomers and a couple of the World War II folks. It was almost half and half adult-only families and families with children, and then about 39% were college graduates, and interestingly, about 57% of those folks had incomes of less than 50%. 33% had visited a museum 3 to 6 times plus in the last couple of years, and then 23% follow on science on social media, where 72% of those people use social media within the week that they took the survey. And by the way, that this distribution of folks was selected by a company that does this People, Place, and Design research, contracted with a company that provides random samples of citizens, and the goal was to mirror the 2015 U.S. Census data, which they did. So, without further ado, the findings. So here are some of the findings, and this is preliminary. This work is not published yet, and it's certainly not all of the results from the work that People, Places, and Design Research did, but I'll share with you some of the highlights. Of those 720 folks, the take-home point from the research team was that ocean expeditions in the Northwest Passage and the Arctic are not in the consciousness of everyday consciousness of the American people. However, 42% had medium to high interest in the Arctic. About 46% had medium to high interest in ocean exploration and research, and about a third thought that they understood the concepts of the Northwest Passage well enough to explain them and also understand sea ice. However, almost 60% were not aware that the Northwest Passage is a shipping route above the Arctic Circle. Another encouraging finding for those of us in this room is that interest in science and attitudes about science and scientists were very positive, well, they said fairly positive, I say very positive compared to what I would have thought. 63% had high or medium interest in science, and you can read this for yourself, but a really important takeaway for me is the last bullet there. 67% agree that politicians need to listen when scientists say that fossil fuels use is hurting our planet. And all of our PowerPoints, by the way, will be posted on the meeting website, so all of this will be available later. So now drilling down into some concepts. This is some, I don't really want to read all this, but this is some of the data that came out of the survey. And you can see that if you look to the far right, knowing a good amount about this concept is fairly low across these 720 folks, just all across the board. And there were other concepts as well that were tested, but they had such a low percentage that we didn't include them here. But it is a little disheartening that people still haven't heard about climate change, even though it's only 3%. But those are the facts. And then in terms of other related concepts, the Arctic is warming faster than other places. More than half of the folks had heard about this or know a bit about it or a fair amount about it. And you can see the rest of the data here. Just give you a second to scan that. I'm going to just read all that. And then we wanted to look at climate change specifically. And the researchers' finding there was that there are believers and skeptics, but most people do believe that climate change is happening. And 88% of these respondents did believe that climate change was happening right now. It's not something coming in the future. A little more than half believe that it's mostly caused by human activity, so we've really got work to do to change that. And then there are still people that believe it's not really happening, and that's no surprise at all. And then the respondents were asked, what would they like to find out more about regarding the status of the Arctic environment and life in the Arctic, and this information was asked specifically to inform the development of the documentary. And this was an open-ended question. So these are the respondents' open-ended answers, and 22% of them mentioned that they would like to learn more about climate change and how fast the ice is melting. And then number two, very close number two, was wildlife. And the responses to that question were pretty far-ranging. And then we also wanted to look at those responses as hooks that we could use that would appeal to the public. And as I mentioned, those responses were pretty far-ranging, and the researchers' takeaway from that is that there really aren't one or two ideas, but there's a lot of ideas that appeal to a few people. So it's hard to really nail down what we were going to address. But the top three areas of interest were learning about the effects of climate change. People really want to see Arctic scenery. They don't know what the Arctic looks like. And they were interested about the outcome of the research that we were going to do. And the top two questions that they'd like a movie to address from the list that they were given, this was not open-ended, were how wildlife in the Arctic is being affected by climate change, and how does the changing Arctic affect people who don't live there. And that was really telling for me personally, because I think people are connected to the Arctic. They're interested about that connection. They may not care too much to learn more, but there's a disconnect there, right? Because some people, only 39% of people are really interested in the Arctic, but yet they want to learn about how it affects them. So that's something that we need to consider as we think further about what content we want folks to learn about. And then these are some of the misconceptions in the comments that were made in the open-ended questions. Have all the polar bears drowned yet? And there was And I didn't put the whole answer there, but the rest of that answer was, I read that they were all supposed to die 10 years ago and they haven't, so climate change clearly isn't happening. I just want to know the truth about the melting of polar ice caps. I'm just not convinced. I'd like to know how much the Arctic is really changing, not from someone pushing an agenda. There's nothing man can do to affect climate. Climate change isn't anything more than a socialist fraud instituted by a bunch of leftists. I really like that one. And of course, the typical why in the world when people think global warming is a thing, there's no scientific proof. So those misconceptions, I think, speak to the kinds of content that we should be embedding into informal science education programming and the kind of research results that we should be leveraging in those education initiatives and programs. And to kind of wrap up with the national baseline study, these are some of the main takeaways that the researchers felt we should be focusing on, which we should be focusing. The majority of respondents support research in general, but don't necessarily have the knowledge to grasp what's being measured and studied or what those results mean. And then due to relatively weak public interest in the Arctic, what they determine is relatively weak interest, it's challenging to engage audiences because we know that it's important to meet an audience where they are and to trigger prior knowledge before we try to educate them with new knowledge. So there's a challenge, really big challenge there for us. And that's something that we have to address. And then finally, the public's belief in the value of science is an important foundation that we can build on. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions about the baseline survey? Yes, Stephanie.
So you had mentioned that people don't care about the Arctic and also that they're not, and here it says there's relatively weak public interest. And is that based on that finding that 49% have medium to high interest in the Arctic? Are both of those statements related to that finding?
I think that was I think they took those statements into consideration, but there were other things in their research that led them to make this statement.
Okay. So the part about caring is not from the survey results directly.
Well, that's one of the factors that they use.
Okay.
And I'm not the researcher, but they have other questions that they ask to tease out how much of that was accurate and how much of that was not accurate. So I can't give you a good, intelligent answer, but they felt that there's certainly not an overwhelming interest in the Arctic.
Did the questionnaire also include definitions? For example, did they ever have tried to define some of their terminology?
No.
Okay, good to know.
There are two parts, I guess. So one, did the research team consider the response bias and how did they handle that?
Yes. Yes, they did, and that's why they deleted 200 responses. They looked through the surveys and deleted the ones they felt had response bias.
Well, how about the people that didn't respond? Presumably they sent out more than 920.
No response.
Yeah, they obviously couldn't analyze no responses. I don't know if they measured who did and did not respond.
And then the second part, I think the cognitive difference between what you think you're interested in, what you think you would watch in a documentary, or what you think you know versus what you might actually know. Do you think they sort of interpreted these results in that frame?
No, I honestly don't. And I wish that Jeff Hayward, the principal of People, Places, and Design Research, could have been with us this week because he's the guy that understands all this. I don't. So, no, I can't answer that question.
I can answer one thing indirect, because our location was one of the places, and the way that they randomized and did the response bias is they just wait for 10 people to go by and then ask the next person. But there was a response bias because most of the time when you're in a group, the man will, defer to the
results of that work. This is the results of the survey that they did with the survey company.
Oh, okay, so
This is not the.
this was a public
Yeah.
survey?
Yeah, yes, this is the public survey. So just to clarify for everybody, people, places, and design research are also studying public perceptions at 3 informal science education institutions using their audiences. And so the Exploratorium is one in San Francisco, Alaska Sea Life Center is another, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History is the 3rd informal science education center. And so we don't have the results of that yet.
It, just kind of looked pretty similar.
Yeah.
I was kind of curious about what seemed to be a bit of a disconnect to me, and that there were only 2% interested in global impacts, and yet there was, and I don't remember the percent, but it was quite large for how it affects them. How does that sit? That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I think most people don't have a global perspective. They have a me at home. We all have kind of a me at home perspective.
Thinking me,
Yeah.
not like a wider.
Right.
Okay. Global is outside the Arctic, but I see there's a twist there. Okay.
Max?
Yeah, this is more of a comment, but I was, one of the things I was really surprised about is one of the questions on climate change when people were asked whether it was natural and human, it was only 4%, which is such a small number that I guess it really highlights that people think it must be one or the other, that the two can't be operating in unison. So that's a really striking number. 4%, I mean, it's almost nobody. Yeah.
And there are other surveys that have had similar results regarding climate change, that people seem to believe that they need to take sides, one or the other. Any other questions about the baseline survey? Okay, so I'll just show you a little bit about the student survey. So that was also an online survey. However, we knew our audiences because we have 5 minority serving institution partners in the project, and the undergraduates are all coming from, our undergraduate participants are all coming from those institutions. And so Jeff Hayward and his colleagues at People, Places, and Design Research surveyed 67 students across those 5 campuses, so it's not a huge sample, but it was an interesting sample for us. Some of those students were going to be participants in our project, although they didn't know it yet. So they had applied to the project. And this sample had many more females than males. 52% of them were from underrepresented and underserved populations, and the largest pod were juniors. But 75% of these students rated STEM as a highly likely career choice. So these are science-minded kids. And in general, they were much more familiar with all of the topics than the general public, and I'll show you some graphs in a second. They were more concerned about climate change. Many considered that their life's work should be dealing with climate change issues and informing the public about them. They had a very strong science identity. 100% of them believe climate change is happening now. And 7% said it's caused by human activity compared with the 56% of the general public. And they really want to learn about what's happening up there. So you can look at this far right column again, and just in your mind, and I'll show you a graph that's more, that makes it more understandable. But just the numbers themselves are much higher in terms of what the students believe they know a lot about and what they can explain. And so here's a graph that the blue lines are the students, the orange lines are the public, and this is familiarity with the concepts, and you see that the students more than doubles in some cases understanding and knowledge of the topics.
Quick question.
Yes.
Does this information here line up with the previous study? So the orange is the public.
Yes. That comes from the baseline.
Right, so what if you take out all the demographics of student age kid, like student age?
it was adults living alone in a house or a family with children under the age of 18, they left out the college-age students from the national baseline study because they wanted to see this comparison. That's a great question.
I was just wondering if maybe I'd be interested in a non-college student age group.
That is the orange here. This is non-college age. The orange, the public, is non-college age.
No, the same age group, but not non-college.
Ah, 10-4, okay.
Yeah. So like what, 18 to 22-year-olds?
The millennials.
Yeah,
Isn't that millennial?
Yeah, they're about
Generation
millennials.
X.
Yes,
they're all
they
good.
did, but I don't believe they were college students.
Right, that's what I was interested in.
So we could ask them to tease that portion out. I get it now.
So you got the 18 to 22-year-old.
Yeah, we can ask them to do that. That would be fairly easy for them to do. That's actually, we need to write that down. That would be a great idea and a great comparison. And then in terms of those other related concepts that we mentioned, you'll see again that the students understand a lot more than the public does. I'm just writing that down because I don't want to forget that. So compare college-age students with the college survey. Thank you for that. Okay. And then the students were asked this open-ended question of what kinds of science and technology activities did they think would be happening on an expedition related to the Arctic. And this is just a list of the ones that all ranked more than 10%. And so you can see that they have some pretty sophisticated topics that they are interested in and think would be happening in a research expedition. So overall, I was very impressed with these undergraduate responses. Yes?
Are these, did they choose from a list?
No.
So these are open-ended?
These were open-ended. This was open-ended. So I think we've got an army of undergraduates out there, hopefully, that are very aware and really understand what's happening in their world. And I know this was a small pod of students, but I'm basing this on other work that we've done as well and in my own interaction with students around the country due to the other work that I do. I really think there's a lot of hope in that age group of students. These are the folks that are going to come after us and are going to need to change the world. They're passionate, they're knowledgeable, and there's a big kernel of hope, at least for me, in that generation of students. So that's kind of a quick summary of what people, places, and design research have discovered through their work. This information, as well as the full work that they've done, has greatly informed our work in terms of what we're putting in webinar content, what we will be putting in the film, the kinds of questions that we're asking our student participants to think about. And I did want to just share with you one brief story about what we did with our high school participants, because we cannot put them on the ship. They don't allow anyone under the age of 18 on this vessel. And so this summer, during the expedition, we plan to have 18 high school and teachers from around the U.S. with teams of 2 of their students each. So we had 6 teachers and 12 students, and we had them in residence in Mission Control for 5 days, and they were part of the whole process of everyone getting on the vessel, and they were going to participate virtually with the scientists and the students as the research commenced, and they were here for the grounding. And so they had a really big lesson in the process of science, the adventure of the Arctic, and what happens in the real world of scientific research. And I was really disappointed for them because, 1, we had planned to do so much more with them if they had been at sea, but 2, I thought this would have been a really wonderful experience for them to interact with the ship, etc. And, you know, after they left, they all said thank you. They had a great time. And we had they met lots of scientists while they were here and had lots of different experiences over the course of that time. But I was obviously very disappointed. And this past Saturday in the mail, I got a thank you card at my home address, but it wasn't this is how small this town is that we're in, Narragansett. I live in this town. It was addressed to me, but the wrong address, several blocks away, but it made its way to me. I think we must have only one mailman in Narragansett. Anyway, anyway, it was from a student in Texas, high school student, one of the ones that were here. And the thank you letter said, "Thank you so much for having us here. This has changed my life and it's changed the way I think. A million thank yous." So I share that with you because we never know what those interactions with the scientific community is going to do for students and the public. A lot of times we think it has to be this big, full-blown extravaganza, and sometimes it just has to be that intimate connection that changes someone's life forever. So I want to leave you with that thought. And any other questions before we break? Yes?
I just wanted to say, come back to this thing about the 49% of the medium to high interest, because you know, that was across all the demographics, basically, in the U.S. And to say that basically half of Americans have a medium to high interest in the Arctic is actually more congruent with what my experience is. I think that's extraordinary. I mean, I think that's a lot to build upon. Right?
It is, I agree.
So
I think in their mind, medium interest doesn't mean is a fair amount of interest. To me, I agree, 100%. People are caring.
But they also care more when you put a survey in front of them. I mean, it's not like the survey was about how do you go shopping and they have to throw the Arctic in. It was more, do you care about the Arctic? And you're like, oh yeah, I guess maybe I do care about the Arctic. And it might have been more of, because you're asking, it's almost a leading question that you're asking them. I hope it's true.
But it just seems like, I don't know about other people's experiences, but in interactions with people in the grocery stores or whatever, people, as soon as they hear Arctic, right, in some context, they just get so interested.
They're triggered. They're triggered.
Partly it's sampling bias, you can those who are interested, but I really do feel like it's a topic that does capture people's imagination.
Well, the National Science Foundation must think so if they have one of the 10 big themes, navigating the new Arctic, right? Yes, Jennifer.
Yeah, I was just going to, related to that, I was just going to say it'd be so interesting to do a very similar study, but on another part of the climate system that's changing rapidly, to see how the Arctic kind of stacks up compared to other things, like, for example, coral reefs or tropical rainforests or, you know, deserts or something like that, and just see how, you know, people are caring about the Arctic relative to other things that they've probably been bombarded with documentaries and things like that.
There's a group that is working for the Ocean Project. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. They've been doing surveys for about 10 years, I think. And they update those surveys regularly, and they have a lot of perception and awareness data about things related to the ocean and climate change. So I'm going to actually write that idea down too. Yes?
I'm assuming that from what you described, the students and everybody had left while the search and rescue was going on.
Oh, no, they were here.
So did they get that explanation of what was happening during
Yes.
the search and
Yes.
rescue?
Yes.
And did you have almost like a debriefing of, okay, what went on? Because that's education too, you know, safety, search and rescue, which is fundamental.
Yes, they were here when the American Embassy in Ottawa was calling by the hour, and the Canadian Coast Guard was contacting us by the hour as the rescue was taking place. It actually took 15 plus hours for the rescuers to get to the ship. And would Max and Donglai and Holly raise their hands?
I wasn't there.
Oh, you weren't? No, I'm sorry. That's right. You weren't there. I'm so sorry, Max. So Holly and Donglai were both on the ship, and I encourage you to connect with them. They can tell you a lot more about what happened. They were there. Yes, exactly. education.
And they were so interested and engaged, and they couldn't believe they were part of this whole, what some of them call disaster.
So I guess that's why the public likes The Deadliest Catch. That's half of it, is the
danger.
So capitalize on that.
That's right. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you very much, and we're going to take a break now. So we'll have some break food out there, and we'll come back in 15 minutes.